So what are some of the things that you saw in Northern Europe, some of the foods that you maybe really miss in the journey as you progress?
I miss the flavor profile being, pretty distinct. In other words, there was spices, things like that, or just the taking, that I've always carried my life, but learning all about what respecting food was all about.
Welcome to the Private Chef podcast, serving the 1%. I'm your host, Hannes Henche, and on our show we speak to the best chefs, how they honed in on their skills to excel in the industry, and what it takes to work as a private chef for some of the most exclusive clients in the world. Hello and welcome back to the Private Chef podcast. I'm your host, Hannes Henche. On today's episode, we're joined by Stephen Kleinman, a private chef, a master of international and regional American cuisine. We'll be talking about his journey from his early days as an executive chef through his time working with Alice Waters and Leon Giovanni. Now he enjoys serving his clients as a personal chef in Florida. He spent a year writing a book about his culinary career, nestled in the jungle of Costa Rica. I really like that part, so we definitely want to hear more about that. So welcome to the show, Stephen.
Thank you. It's so good to see you today.
So tell us a little bit about where did your culinary experience or love for cooking start?
In my grandmother's kitchen. So my mother couldn't cook. She burnt the tuna noodle casserole. She made cakes that were no thicker than a dime. Her cookies were unbelievably terrible. Her pancakes, you could wring in your hands and get all the oil out of them. So obviously I sought good food somewhere else. Unfortunately, I had two grandmothers that were from old school. They cooked in their kitchens all day long. And that's all they were concerned with. It seemed like to me, obviously they had other concerns, but they cooked from, a recipe that was in their head, but it was handed down from their mother and from their mother and from their mother. And so they did things that were, fresh. They did canning, they did brining, they did every aspect of cooking. They went to markets to seek fresh food. It was the fishmonger, it was the butcher. They baked all their breads and pastries. And sometimes they had 10, maybe 15 people that they were feeding, and sometimes it was just a couple. But they cooked all day long, and I would be able to watch them. And I credit them with, first of all, developing my palate, and how, the flavor profile of the foods just penetrated my senses, and I was able to, catch up to what I used the rest of my life really in cooking was just from them. So that's how I got started. My first time in the kitchen, I was 8 years old, and my parents owned restaurants and hotels in Europe. And I asked my dad one day for a bike, and he said, "Go down and peel some potatoes at one of their restaurants." And I got a sack of potatoes to peel, which I thought was, obviously it was a 25, 50 pound. I don't know how it was in Norway, so it was in kilos, obviously. But anyway, it seemed like an enormous task for an 8-year-old to peel a sack of potatoes. And I don't know how long it took. It seemed like it was like a couple of, long time. But I got it done. And the next day, my dad gave me a bike. And I was like, well, this is, maybe something I should look into. I was pretty motivated at the time. My grandfather was a Supreme Court justice in Norway, and I liked sitting in his big chair in his office, and I could envision myself young to be like a lawyer. but cooking overtook me, and I got exposed by grandmas and that first day in the kitchen of my father's kitchen. So that's how I got started.
It seems like a good deal, a sack of potatoes for a bike.
Good deal. I kept thinking that was a good deal, and I would continue doing sacks of potatoes for a while and other things until I actually started an apprenticeship when I was between 12 and 13 years old. So it was for a while.
It's funny. I have a similar memory of like I don't know how many hours of that day I spent peeling potatoes. But for a child, it always seems like it's never ending. It's never getting less. It's like
one day they brought at the time. So this would have been 1959-ish, 60. They brought this machine in that had this rotor to it, and it had like sandpaper on the inside of it, and you could put potatoes in it, and it would peel the potatoes. And I was going, yay, this was a great invention. I was going to try and find out who did that and thank them personally. But yeah, that was my end of my potato duties, basically. I mean, I still had to put the potatoes in and put them in water and so forth and so on, but I got to start doing other things too in the kitchen.
So where did they own their hotels and restaurants? That was all in Norway?
Yeah. Actually, they traveled. I think they got them in, might have gotten them in Denmark. And that would be about it. But they were called Vikruas. So my mother, being American, she came up with the idea that they should serve like hamburgers, right? And so it was the first hamburger stand in Europe, basically. I mean, there's hamburgers in other countries as such, but not sold like this. I mean, I remember going with her to a baker in the particular town we were in and formulating the perfect bun. And they put that together. And so they had like Wiener Schnitzel, they had burgers. I can't remember exactly what else was on there, but they were called Baikrua. And then they owned some small hotels that sat usually on the waterways, on the fjords. They were no bigger than maybe 50, maybe 75 rooms, something like that. But all of them had a full staff in them as far as the culinary and the front of the house and the housekeepers and stuff. So before, when as a kid, I would travel the closest ones and just get into the kitchen because I was always looking for something to eat. And so, I kind of, the people knew who I was, and so I had an advantage, obviously. But, I got to really feeling at home, so to speak, in those kitchens, and people were really cool. But I also saw, pots and pans flying, people getting upset, this incredible tenseness of trying to, well, I didn't know what was going on, but, obviously you're trying to get the food out. And then there was a calmness with usually the chef that, brought it all together. And I admired that type of atmosphere. I thought, well, all this cussing and carrying on and having knives in your hand and preparing food and things like that. I thought, wow, this is really cool. So that's how I got bitten by the bug, So it was pretty interesting.
I always wonder why people get attracted to that rather rough atmosphere, where people are screaming at each other, and it looks like this entire almost like a violent scene at times, in the peak service times, and everybody's just like screaming top of their lungs. Like, what is it about us that attracts us to that?
Well, I think there was like TGIF Fridays. I heard a guy that used to run those, and he said it was called organized chaos. And, I think it from the outside looking in, it does look like, chaos. I don't know how organized it was, but then when you're in the middle of it, I mean, your adrenaline, it's a rush. You're to me, it's like performing, on stage every time. I used to have butterflies every time, I went out and was actually, cooking. Later on in my life, a lot of us did a shot of whiskey, before we would get on the line and things like that. So, but it's being in the middle of that chaos that really tracks, I think. But it's extremely intense, and that's why a lot of people become, either alcoholics or they quit the kitchen and go somewhere else because they can't take all that. Or they stay there and endure and then start growing in whether it's upward or just sideways. But I think that's what attracts people in there. That's what attracted me, was that excitement.
Yeah. So what are some of the things that you saw in Northern Europe, some of the foods that you maybe really miss in the journey as you progress? Like now being in the United States, that I think craftsmanship and the way food is approached is very different than in Northern Europe, but probably also Northern Germany. So what are some of the things that you really miss?
I miss the flavor profile being, pretty distinct. In other words, there was spices that we have here. Obviously, there's spices universal, but the caraway seed, the cinnamon, the cardamoms, things like that really you wouldn't necessarily correlate maybe to those cuisines, but things like that, or just the taking, that I've always carried my life, but learning all about what respecting food was all about. I could say things like, pheasant or wild game of any kind. Certainly all the sausages and things that were made, the pastry items, that we never, we see replicated here by somebody that maybe came from those countries and decided to open up a bakery, and people really enjoy it. But I miss. I used to walk. I lived in a town called Breivik, which was a small town, and it had the longest span bridge going across to the other side. But we had our bike right there at the beginning of the side of the highway before you went over. But I would travel into town and go to the bakery and go to the fishmongers. And actually, I worked in a fishery once. So those sights and smells and feelings. I'd never tasted scrambled eggs in my whole life over in the United States that were done there. I learned the technique later on. I learned it there, but it was brought up again when I went to culinary school. Just that creamy fluffiness of those eggs and things like that with chives in them and things. And yeah, it was those types of things were definitely. I try and recreate them. I remember them out of my memory. I don't have I can look up recipes. Today it's so easy to do all these things. But yeah, I miss that if so.
But some of the recipes that we have access to today are not necessarily the same. Like I found a couple of my older cookbooks, that were still like handwritten, and that stuff that kind of goes down in a lineage of chefs. And some of that is not necessarily what we will find, online or in books. So I think despite recipes being easily available, I think the great recipes are still, they're still not out in the open for everybody just to download them on a click.
Well, the recipes from my grandmothers were not written down. And I did receive from one of my grandmothers a written copy of some stuff, some, whether it was bread or some entrees or things like that, or some specific. But those are things that I have in my head that I was taught. Whether it was a particular stew that was so simple with just carrot, onions, and beef, but it was made in such a way and braised in such a way and seasoned in such a way, those types of things have always, are there in my repertoire when it comes up. The only other really, this book here was my first cookbook, La Repertoire. Okay. So this has about 1,700 recipes in it, and none of them have procedures. They just tell you what it is, and it tells you, exactly what the ingredients is. And if you don't know how to put the stuff together, it's tough luck. And this was my first cookbook, and I memorized this book. So every time I went on the line anywhere, I was required to know this. Chefs didn't, they said a specific dish or, a sauce or whatever. I cheated sometimes because this is a small book, so I could have it somewhere and refer to it. But after a while, it just became La Repertoire. It became something that I did all the time. But that's really old school, this is with roux and different things. So I had to change up the way that I cooked as time went on too. So, but yeah, we get diluted. It's like me telling you a story right now, and you tell the story to somebody else, and something's going to be left out. And I think that's why interpretations. It's funny, you could get a chef from the same country, and you can make something, and no, that's not how you do it. I mean, you go down to Louisiana. I spent some times in New Orleans, and there's one household that makes their gumbo different from the other household, and so forth and so on. And they're all legitimate, but they all have it. There's no the gumbo that that you could refer to. So I think that's part of it. That's part of it.
Yeah, I guess the same is true for most ethnical cuisines. There's like different regions and different households have their own interpretation. Even so, it's more or less, and even if you give people the same recipe, you will get different dishes. That's the interesting thing. And I think it's one of the challenges to be a professional chef is actually to have that level of consistency where it always comes out the same. That's also very challenging for restaurants, not just McDonald's that have a whole concept around that, but really good restaurants know how to train their people in such a way that no matter who is cooking, there's a certain level and excellence to it.
I agree there. I probably up to a certain point was the worst nightmare in a string of cooking in different restaurants, but in a couple of restaurants in particular. I was the owner's worst nightmare because, I was creating dishes a la Steve. Even though it was trout almondine, you might not get the same trout almondine the next time, so forth and so on. There was no consistency there. And then I had this really great, lesson because I ended up going from those situations into culinary school at the California Culinary Academy in San Francisco. And I got into baking. And my first day in baking class, I thought, wow, this is really stupid because they're using measurements, and I that's not for me. And I learned very quickly, especially from the chef instructor, you better use this or you're not going to pass this class. Number one, and number two, as a chef, you need to know every aspect of this, no matter if it's in this class or any other class. And that gave me the discipline to start understanding really what consistency was. It took that. It was my ego and my pride and, I'm so great and all this other stuff that was so ridiculous to get there. And then I actually had a stint as a pastry chef for the Westin Hotels in Vail for, I think it was a summer, and I was like, putting things together and, the wedding cake and, this and pastillage and, some showpieces and things like that. So, and then I was thankful to that instructor because he taught me, the discipline I needed to really be a good cook, to be, that's foremost.
Yeah, especially when it comes to baking, if you don't have proper measurements, you're doomed. It's like a science, and it's really crucial to stick a lot closer to the recipe than in the cooking of other recipes.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all that. I had a restaurant once and I made my own bread and made my own pastries. And, there was a whole kind of period there that I didn't look at the recipe book eventually because I had these measurements totally ingrained in my head. And yes, I measured, and yes, they always turned out, but eventually it was this. I think as we become better cooks, our interpretation of food from our heart to our hands is hallmark to that whole effort. And part of that feel of things, I think, comes through recipes and making the food the right way and respecting it. But it also has this, for me, it had this reverence about the food itself and what the outcome was going to be. And I was very particular about everybody should have the same, dish that I just made for that person, and the cooks that were in my restaurant too. So it changes. I mean, some of us don't learn these lessons, and we're still lousy cooks. And some people end up in the chef's chair, and they really don't know how to cook. And and that shows up. I was in a hotel once where, the chef would come out and everybody would, stand straight and step back from their station. And he was there to teach us something, and he would do something and it would be absolutely ridiculous. And, he'd go back to his office and all of us would, try not to disrespect, but we had to giggle and kind of, say, what was that all about? And then, go back to our work. But that's an example, I think, of that you either have it or you don't. You have to be a good cook to be a chef. And that isn't the case always in our society, in our cooking here in the United States. There's a huge amount of people that don't know how to cook. And they wear a chef's toque, or actually they don't wear toques anymore. So, but they carry the name, and that's fine. That really is fine because they're accepted in their environment. People like me do not have to go and criticize, but I can always, if I'm teaching culinary, I can always use that as an example of, you just need to cook. Whenever I get into as a private chef and get into situations, I might have some difficulties, whether it's with, just the environment and things like that. The only thing I know every time I step to the plate and cook is that the food needs to be my best effort and it needs to taste absolutely wonderful. And everything else kind of melts away, whether it was the atmosphere or anything like that. So,
yeah, I think that's a crucial piece. And you also said it earlier. You grow upwards or you grow sideways. And I think if you always make an effort to bring the very best food on the plate, the direction is rather upwards than sidewards. And also what you mentioned about a chef actually needs to know how to cook. I remember when I was a child, my grandpa always used to tell me that titles are only as good as the person's performance. Like a master is only a master if he can actually perform the trade well. And that always stuck with me, that titles don't make a great leader in any field or a great teacher of anything if they can't really master the trade, or they haven't mastered the trade rather.
I taught 3,200 students in culinary school. I tallied them up one day just to see how many. And, some of those, quite few, became, chefs. A few of them became restaurateurs. A few of them owned companies and things like that were still in food and beverage. And, the titles, yes, they were important, but they stuck to what the principles were of the cooking that they knew were the right methods, the right way to seek out food, the right way to present, the right way to treat people in the kitchen. All that stuff plays, together in the total picture. I used to tell people, if you come in here angry and you want to make some food, your food is going to taste angry. If you come in here with love in your heart and all your problems in the world are left at the door, then, that's where you need to be. So
I think this is why grandma's food always tastes so much better, because she definitely carries the love in her heart, no?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. I think there's something to be said about what you, and there's actually a documentary around it, and I don't have the name of it, but it includes a couple of Austrian scientists where, and without going too far and sounding too foo-foo, but that there's literally something that changes in food and water depending on how we treat it and how we kind of as you said, the atmosphere we create around it. And for some people that might sound very far out, but since there's some science to this, I'm comfortable to saying on the record.
I just saw a new movie called The Menu. I don't know if you heard about it, but if you watch it, it is definitely right down the road of what you should or shouldn't do as a cook or a chef. I mean, it goes to the extremes. Yeah, I don't want to ruin it for anybody, but that's. I sat there with my girlfriend the other night and watched it, and we both looked at each other. She's a chef too, and it was like, oh my goodness. So if anybody has a chance, they should go see The Menu. It's out in your theater now. So
great. I'll have to make sure to check up on that. So what inspired you to write your book, and what inspired you to write your book in Costa Rica? And it's a beautiful place, and you really found a paradise for yourself there.
Well, I had written another part of the book, and it was more of the dark side of my life that I think maybe some of us get into. I've had a long, good life, but I was into things that were common back in the 60s and 70s for somebody my age and the people I hung out with. And I lived in a mountain town for 20 years that was totally insane. I mean, it was totally insane. And it was the what I call I don't know if I should say it's the dark side, but it was definitely the other side of me. And then, so I wrote that, and that took about 8 years to get done. And I was going to publish it, but then I thought that maybe there's still more of a story here. So I sat in the jungle in Costa Rica and wrote the other side of the story. And I'm still working on it. I probably have about a year, almost a year into it. And I don't really, it's been really good. This part that I explained about my grandmother's, my first day in the kitchen, going to culinary school, working in these restaurants in Breckenridge, Colorado, owning my own restaurants and hotels, and all the places that I've been able to cook in. And that's what it's really about. It's just a personal story. I don't put names in the characters because it doesn't have to carry a name necessarily, although I guess a couple would. But, I talk about my first time in a large hotel, and, my chef, I was the sous chef at the time, and then rose to executive sous chef. So I was cooking in this huge hotel in San Francisco and going to culinary school at the same time. And I would go to work, and we had this incredible chef that was from France, and Gerard Behon, and he was just unbelievable and gentle and had everything. And I wrote all the recipes, and the hotel wasn't open. I'd go there after school every day and write all this stuff and hand it in and so forth and so on. But about 2 weeks before we were going to open, he quit. And so the executive sous chef took over as chef, and this guy was totally, absolutely crazy. But his culinary skills were above, way above. But his habits at the time were, totally off the wall. So in those days, and sometimes now, that the chef's office would be back off the kitchen, but be elevated, and so you could see all the stations, so you could see some of the kitchen. And he would go back there at about 3:30 in the afternoon, and he would drink the finest alcohol he could get his hands on, and maybe do some things that you weren't supposed to do, and he'd close the blinds and lock the door. So as the sous chef, the general manager, the food and beverage director would come and say, "Where is this guy?" And I would say, "Oh, he went home," or whatever it was. And they'd say, "Well, good, you're in charge, blah, blah, blah." So I got to run this, 4 restaurant plus room service hotel with 32 chefs from all over the world there. And that was my first time that I got to, just do it. But I got, baptism by fire. And, some of those experiences are in my book. I mean, it's just totally insane. And, I talk about in the book too, as we're never trusted. Nobody trusts you until they can trust you, which usually takes quite a bit, because you're given assignments and you do them, and there's a little tweak that could be done better. It's that on that level, and it keeps going on and on and on until one day you've done the task and they're absolutely perfect. Okay. But you're not trusted yet. Now, the next time you do them absolutely perfect, and then that trust starts building in the person. So that's how I was always taught. And, it's kind of a funny thing, because I think people if they don't know anything about how this works, they take offense to it. They decide they're going to go work somewhere else. And it's not, for me, it wasn't, I've worked with chefs that throw pots and pans at you and knives if it's not done right. But I learned from that French chef, for example, everything had to be talked. You had to meet with the people ahead of time, ahead of service again, tell what was going on. Everything had to be planned to the utmost. So that was a better way to put people in the mix and get them to excel in what they were good at. I mean, not everybody is and good at everything, but they're good at something. And it is part of to learn how to be a chef is what I was writing about, was learning how to recognize that in people and then figure out how to draw that out of them. Being gentle, for me, it was being gentle. It was talking to them. It wasn't like we went out and had beers afterwards, or it was this huge camaraderie, but it was a professionalism of being respectful and things. And those people excelled then. And then you had this army that you could go to battle with and do I would always tell my staffs, I would put you up against any other staff in the world because you are ready. And sure enough, when the battles came and that tenseness came and the organized chaos was going on, we did it really well. And I knew as a chef, and I learned this, of course, that I got the accolades for it. It was my kitchen. I represented the hotel or the restaurant or whatever it was, but they did it. And I never, the dishwasher, the stewards were the most important part of the kitchen as far as I was concerned, because if it wasn't organized, if it wasn't clean, we couldn't, mentally go on with the rest of the day. If I walked in the kitchens that the floors were dirty and the pots and pans were so and all that stuff, it just was demoralizing. And of course, then the food reflects it. But if everything was taken care of, so I always respected them. I always hired people at the very beginning, go wash dishes, go be a steward for a few days. And then, you'd always get that pushback a little bit. But in the back of my mind, and then they realized it, they started learning where all the dishes went, where all the pots and pans were, how difficult the work was, and maybe some of them had never, ever been in a dishwasher. They had always been a line cook or whatever it was, not even a prep cook or a commis. But, so that was the way of culture. For me, I'd learned that, and I write about that in the book, and it was in different situations. I ran a convention center with a sports venue and a theater venue. I had 1,200 employees. I couldn't do it by myself. And I had to nurture a whole brigade of people that understood. I met with them every day. And if I had to show them things that I had learned and that were good for what we were doing, that I did. I didn't sit in the office a lot, but it was by example, I think. And then the sous chefs, the executive sous chef for that whole thing, they did the same thing. So it was great. It was great. So I write about that in the book. And so it's an interesting journal. I don't know when it will get published, and I'm just working on it. So yeah, it's called Cooking by Numbers, Chef's Tale, or a Cook's Tale. Excuse me, not a Chef's Tale, a Cook's Tale. So
I think there's something to be said about nurturing culture the same way. And what came to my mind when you were talking about, being in those positions of the steward or the dishwasher is, I spent a couple of days at 11 Madison Park in New York, and I saw the head chef emphasizing so strongly how important it is, that they are part of the team, they're equal to the cooks. And, that he's like, these guys take their job as serious as you do. They come here on time, they come sober, they don't do any nonsense. And for him, it was really important that everybody in the team understood that, they're no lesser by any means, and that they're taking their job just as seriously. And I think, as you said, that's the foundation to run the entire operation clean and professionally.
Early on, besides my grandmother's and the one cook that I apprenticed with, and that apprenticeship I write in the book too, was, starting with, those were my father's chefs and kitchens and stuff. And here, the son of the owner was coming in. And so I had to kind of change that paradigm if I was going to, well, actually it was changed for me because right away the chef that I was working with, she was, and I've cooked for a lot of ladies, a lot of female people, and I have so much reverence for, because I think that the mothers, quite honestly, are the backbone, the foundation of our cooking. No matter who the great chef of the world is, they learned by their mothers. I'm pretty sure. Not completely with every one of them, but pretty sure. But anyway, I would get in situations that just demanded this discipline. And this first chef that I apprenticed with, the first day she said, "Get a toothbrush, start cleaning the floor. Get on the cracks, do the corners and the toilet." And I did that for a while. I don't know how long, but it was definitely more than a couple of weeks. And one day she called me in and she said, "Are you ready to cook?" And I said, "Yes, chef." And that's what the journey started. But that was, I mean, how much humility goes to that, I cooked in kitchens and learned from, I had the privilege of cooking with Alice Waters and Chef Ani. And at the time, she had Jeremiah Tower in the kitchen as her chef. And they would, technically, the food would be great and all that stuff, but it wouldn't be as good as it could have been because they were at odds with each other quite a bit. And I learned, in that situation, how not to run a kitchen. So those experiences really shaped me. I cooked for my culinary school in San Francisco was full of. I mean, I got to go to Hong Kong with Ken Home. Roberto Giovanni in San Francisco. I cooked at his restaurant and learned how to make everything, from roasting coffees to, the great pastas and things like that. Bruce Adels, who you see labeled with, sausage in almost every grocery store in the United States now. I learned charcuterie from him. Great pastry chefs. At the time, it's like, you'd go. I compare it to going to concerts for the first time, seeing like the Rolling Stones, and they were a little band. When I saw them the first time, and you look at them and you say, "Well, this is great music," but you don't know that they're going to be 50 years later where they are today. And it was the same thing with those chefs. I didn't know, what I didn't really care, but I can say that I came from some lineage from my experience with them, and that reflects in the book too. So
yeah,
it's good stuff.
Well, I hope you get to finish it soon, so we get to read it even sooner.
Yeah, it'll probably be on Amazon sometime in 2023.
Great. Well, Stephen, this has been a super interesting conversation. Thank you so much for your time. Where can people connect with you?
It's been a very humbling pleasure to talk to you today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us at the Private Chef podcast. If you know any highly skilled chefs that want to take their life to the next level, make sure to share this podcast with them. And if you enjoyed this episode, click subscribe and check out our upcoming episodes. Thank you for listening.